This is the video for Lesson 5.10, Complex Times. By 1968, many Americans were exhausted by political assassinations, bitter arguments over civil rights, the war in Vietnam, urban riots, and the widening gap in values between themselves and their baby boomer children. Some yearned for order and stability and made their feelings known at the polls. In a very close election, voters chose Richard M. Nixon, a Republican who promised to repair the battered social order at home and to bring peace abroad. The goals for this lesson: describe Nixon's election in 1968, including the Southern strategy. Identify Henry Kissinger's role in guiding Nixon's foreign policy in China, and explain détente and how it changed the Cold War. Don't forget to go to lesson resources, get your reading guide and/or lesson answer key so you can follow along with the reading. And let's begin on page 872, which is just the beginning of the chapter, and it's called The Politics of Power. By 1968, Americans were growing weary after years of shocks and strains. By assassinations of national leaders, bitter arguments over civil rights and the war in Vietnam, urban riots, and a widening gap in values between parents of the World War II generation and their baby boomer children. Many people yearn for order and stability. For the next decade, voters of both majority parties would support presidential candidates who promised to repair the battered social order at home and bring peace abroad. Some of these hopes for stability would be realized. The war in Vietnam would end, though not easily or quickly. The Cold War began to thaw a bit, but the nation would be rocked by a crisis of leadership. During the administration of Richard Nixon, a scandal now known by the single word, Watergate, would shape people's confidence in government. The Nixon presidency. Richard Nixon won the presidential campaign of 1968. Going into the election, however, he was in many ways an unlikely candidate. Nixon, formerly vice president under Eisenhower, had suffered two recent electoral losses. He had lost the 1960 presidential race to John F. Kennedy, and then in 1962 lost his run for governor of California. After the California defeat, he bitterly told reporters, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore, because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference." Time magazine concluded that, barring a miracle, Richard Nixon could never hope to be elected to any political office again. But Nixon made a political comeback. By 1968, many Americans saw him as a seasoned statesman who would be tough against the communist challenge abroad and equally tough on criminals and protesters at home. The politics of the 1968 election. As a Republican candidate in 1968, Nixon faced a vulnerable Democratic Party. The Democrats were weakened not only by their chaotic convention in Chicago, watched by millions of television viewers, but also by deep divisions within the party. On one side, liberal anti-war Democrats opposed the party nominee, Vice President Hubert Humphrey, for supporting Johnson's Vietnam policies. On the other side, many conservative Democrats, especially in the South, thought Humphrey was too liberal, especially in his views on civil rights. They were attracted to a third-party candidate, former Alabama Governor George Wallace, a supporter of racial segregation. Although many Southerners favored Wallace, Nixon campaigned hard for a white Southern vote. The South had long voted Democratic, but that had changed under Kennedy and Johnson when the party threw its support behind the civil rights movement. Seeing his opportunity, Nixon appealed to many Southerners' distrust of Washington. He told Southern audiences that he favored states' rights and that his domestic program, which he called the New Federalism, would transfer power from Washington back to the states. He also emphasized law and order, which many understood as a code phrase for cracking down on rioters in the cities and radical student protesters on campuses. In an extremely close election, Wallace won 5 traditionally Democratic Southern states, enough to deprive Humphrey of an electoral vote majority. Nixon won 6 Southern states. These victories, combined with states in the Midwest and East, brought him a majority in the Electoral College, though he won only 43.4% of the popular vote to Humphrey's 42.7%. Nixon's Southern strategy would remain a powerful Republican tactic for decades to come. The unexpected moderate. But let's read Rachel Carson's Silent Spring first. The formation of the Environmental Protection Agency in December 1970 was the result of a groundswell in public concern and legislative action about pollution and other environmental risks, largely prompted by a best-selling book published in 1962, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. Carson, a marine biologist, warned of the dire hazards of the overuse of pesticides, especially the widely used DDT, on humans, animals, and plants. The title, Silent Spring, evokes a possibility of a spring when there are no birds left to sing. Her book provoked angry, sometimes personal attacks by the pesticide and agricultural industry. Despite attempts to discredit her work, her argument prevailed and led to an eventual ban on DDT. The Environmental Protection Agency, in an account of its origins, declares that the EPA may be said without exaggeration to be the extended shadow of Rachel Carson. Indeed, according to the EPA writer, Silent Spring played in the history of environmentalism roughly the same role that Uncle Tom's Cabin played in the abolitionist movement. An unexpected moderate. Nixon had campaigned as a hard-nosed conservative, but once in the White House he made a little effort to roll back the major achievements of the Johnson administration, such as the Medicare and the Voting Rights Act. Despite Nixon's call for returning some federal powers to the states, he strengthened some of Johnson's Great Society programs and even expanded federal power into new areas. This surprised Democratic opponents and disappointed leading conservative Republicans, such as Governor Ronald Reagan of California. To fight poverty, Nixon proposed a sweeping initiative, the Family Assistance Program, which would replace the nation's patchwork of welfare benefits with a single system guaranteeing at least some income for all poor families. Conservatives opposed the plan as too liberal, while liberals thought its cash allowances were too low. But the proposal was a far cry from Nixon's harsh campaign rhetoric slamming welfare recipients. As president, Nixon made protection of the environment a centerpiece of his domestic policy. Clean air, clean water, open spaces, these should once again be the birthright of every American, he said. He created the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. In 1970, he signed the Clean Air Act, which authorized the states and the federal government to develop regulations setting limits on emissions from factories and vehicles such as trucks and automobiles, and he set aside more than 80,000 acres of federal lands for public parks. Under Nixon, the Labor Department addressed problems of racial discrimination in the building and construction trades. Nixon approved a plan that opened thousands of construction and trade jobs to African Americans by requiring businesses contracting with the federal government to set goals for hiring more minorities. Later reflecting on this plan, Nixon said that it was both necessary and right to acquire federal contractors to show affirmative action to meet the goals of increasing minority employment. Nixon's actions represented the most substantial effort by the federal government up to that time to apply the principle of affirmative action. Let's read the excerpt on the moon landing. On May 1961, John F. Kennedy told Congress, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth." He did not live to see the fulfillment of his goal. NASA's Apollo program, despite opposition and setbacks, including an accident that took the lives of two astronauts, did meet Kennedy's challenge early in the presidency of Richard Nixon. In the summer of 1969, 3 astronauts of the Apollo 11 mission, Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, boarded the spacecraft Columbia. It took 3 days to reach the moon's orbit. Armstrong and Aldrin squeezed into a small lunar landing module called Eagle and descended to the lunar surface. Armstrong radioed back to the flight center in Houston, Texas. "The Eagle has landed." It was July 20th, 1969. 6 hours later, with more than 1 billion people around the world watching on TV, Armstrong climbed down a ladder and stepped onto the moon's surface. "That's one small step for man," he said, "one giant leap for mankind." Aldrin joined Armstrong on the moon's surface, where they planted an American flag. The United States had won the race to the moon. What did it mean? In terms of the Cold War, the moon landing boosted American pride. Not only for Americans, but for millions of people around the world of various nationalities, the grainy televised images of Neil Armstrong stepping onto the lunar surface inspired optimism and hope in a century that had been marked by violence and upheaval. It proved, as President Kennedy had said, that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. A global strategy. Nixon had built his political reputation in the late 1940s and 50s as a crusading anti-communist. Yet as president, he would build bridges to the communist leaders of China and the Soviet Union. In foreign affairs, Nixon's most urgent task was to end the deeply unpopular U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia. His strategy, turning over the ground war to South Vietnamese while increasing pressure on North Vietnam with massive bombing, led to a tentative peace agreement in 1972. The settlement deflated the anti-war theme of Nixon's Democratic opponent in the 1972 election, Senator George McGovern of South Dakota, whom Nixon beat in a landslide. Nixon in China. In foreign affairs, Nixon, guided by the architect of his foreign policy, Henry Kissinger, aimed to reduce the danger of an all-out war with the Soviet Union by extending a hand of friendship to the Soviets' rival in Asia, the Communist People's Republic of China. Ever since Mao Zedong led the communist takeover of China in 1949, the United States and Western Europe had assumed that Red China and the Soviet Union formed a close and dangerous alliance. After all, both were communist nations. But Kissinger and Nixon saw that the two countries had different interests, and the United States might take advantage of these differences. They reasoned that if the Americans could ease relations with China, then the Soviets would feel compelled to improve their own relationship with the United States, if only to prevent China and the United States from creating an alliance against the Soviets. Given his long record of fiercely anti-communist policies, the idea of Richard Nixon getting friendly with Chinese communists at first sounded preposterous. But that perception gave Nixon an advantage, since you could never be accused of being soft on communism. He believed that no American politician was better positioned to engineer a thaw in the Cold War. For months, Kissinger met secretly with Chinese leaders. An invitation from the Chinese to the United States table tennis team, a favorite Chinese sport, was the first sign of warming relations. Then in February 1972, with the world's press watching, Nixon made a historic trip to China. He met with government leaders, visited the legendary Great Wall, and even paid a courtesy call on the aging Mao Zedong. And there's a picture there. The visit to China had the effects Nixon and Kissinger had hoped for. Trade and exchanges between the United States and China expanded. In North Vietnam, communist leaders pressured by the Chinese signaled they were willing to make concessions that would lead to peace in Vietnam. And in Moscow, the Soviet Union's leaders signaled an interest in holding their own talks with the Americans. Let's look at the map here quickly. A world divided, we're just seeing the United States and their allies, Soviet Union and their allies, and other communist countries in the gold color. Okay, détente, easing tensions. In May 1972, just 3 months after his trip to China, Nixon met with Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. The two formed a surprising friendship, perhaps in part because both knew full well the strains of the Cold War. By the early 1970s, both the United States and the Soviet Union were seeking ways to ease tensions between their two countries. This effort to establish better relations was known as détente, a French word meaning easing of tension. The Soviet leader Brezhnev was interested in détente because his nation's economy was suffering from the cost of the Cold War. The race between the two superpowers was to build up their armies, and nuclear arms had proven terribly expensive. Brezhnev saw that the USSR could not afford to build weapons as quickly as the United States. Brezhnev hoped that better relations with the U.S. would relieve the burden of the arms race and lead to more trade with the West, which would in turn help the Soviet economy. The American economy, too, had been strained by the arms race and the fighting in Vietnam. President Nixon believed that détente with the Soviets might be a way to reduce military spending and lessen the likelihood of more wars. As part of détente, the superpowers tried to slow the buildup of nuclear arms. In 1969, the United States and the USSR had begun negotiations known as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT for short. In 1972, Nixon signed treaties often called SALT I. While these treaties did not end the arms race, they placed important limitations on the development of nuclear weapons. The policy of détente did not end the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union would remain adversaries for years, but détente substantially reduced the chances of a devastating nuclear war, the possibility of which had troubled the world since the end of World War II. Other crises. Nixon managed 2 other major foreign crises. In 1971, India and Pakistan, bitter rivals since their independence from Britain in 1947, became embroiled in an armed conflict. At stake was the fate of East Pakistan, now called Bangladesh, a breakaway region that sought independence from the government in Pakistan's capital, Islamabad. Pakistan was a close ally of China, with whom the Nixon administration was then conducting secret diplomatic talks. So the administration backed Pakistan, delivering a much-needed military and humanitarian assistance. Despite this aid, Indian military forces won the war, resulting in the independence of Bangladesh. The war in the Middle East posed another danger. In 1973, on the eve of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the holiest of the Jewish holidays, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat launched an Egyptian-led invasion of Israel. Several other Arab countries either contributed aid or entered this fourth Arab-Israeli war.